Let's talk about the Dutch East India Company and how the spice trade turned them into a powerful military force. It may sound very strange now, but in the past, spices were more expensive than gold. Such a high price was due to the fact that spices were grown in Asian countries at that time. And in the past, such remoteness was a serious barrier to trade. Because before the sea route to Asia was opened, spice traders had to travel a considerable distance from Vietnam or Indonesia all the way to Europe. And in the process of this journey, the product itself could change a number of intermediaries who bought it, and then resold it more expensive. Also, at that time, it was a dangerous journey that could end tragically for the trade caravan. And it was precisely because of these transportation features that the price for the end consumer in Europe grew to astronomical amounts. And that is why only kings or very wealthy people could afford spices. What is the value of just one historical episode when in 408, the Visigothic king Alaric demanded 3,000 pounds of pepper from the Roman authorities as payment for not plundering Rome? And that is why, due to the high value of these spices, people were even ready to kill for them. The first Europeans to open a sea route to Asia were the Portuguese. Later, they found places where these spices were grown and produced, and so they became the first Europeans to begin supplying spices to Europe without intermediaries. Then the Spaniards joined them, and for several decades, these two countries monopolized the spice trade, until the Dutch broke this monopoly. The first attempts of the Dutch to engage in the spice trade can be called rather chaotic experiments of a number of merchants. But after several expeditions returned with quite good booty, they had a plan. Instead of acting individually, let's better combine our efforts and financial capabilities to trade under the auspices of one company. That way, we will have more strength and opportunities to resist the Spaniards and Portuguese. It would seem a simple solution, but neither the Portuguese nor the Spaniards thought of it, which they would later regret. So in 1602, the Dutch East India Company was created, which received from the Dutch Parliament a monopoly on trade with the East Indies region, which then included territories within the Indian and Pacific Oceans. And it was not just a document. This monopoly actually gave the company permission to destroy its competitors. And already in 1603, the first flotilla sailed from Amsterdam, the purpose of which was not only trade, but also the search for and destruction of competitors. We can say that the first years of its existence, the company only fought. And it fought quite successfully. This was primarily due to differences in approaches. The Spanish and Portuguese considered each of their expeditions as a separate project, and the financing of each new expedition depended on the success of the previous one, which significantly narrowed the possibilities of attracting more forces. At the same time, the Dutch, by joining forces, could field a larger fleet. And the goals themselves were more long-term, and not maximizing the profit of each expedition. Therefore, it is not at all surprising that after reducing the threat at sea, the company began land expansion to capture enemy fortified garrisons and factories. They began by capturing the Portuguese fort on the island of Ambon, which would later become the company's local headquarters, from which they would plan operations to seize control of the region. And later, the company captured a number of more islands, creating a whole network of warehouses, factories, and fortified forts from Arabia to Japan. However, the company achieved real success when one of the company's top managers became the pragmatic, ruthless, uncompromising Pieterszoon Coen. Coen's character was greatly influenced by his participation in the company's earlier expeditions. During one of these expeditions, when the commander of the company's flotilla, Admiral Verhoef, wanted to force the inhabitants of the Banda Islands to trade exclusively with the Dutch company, they tricked him into a trap and killed him. And after that unsuccessful expedition, Coen, as its participant, formed a firm view that no one could be trusted, and one could achieve one's goals only through the use of force. He received his promotion to the management level after he prepared a rather ambitious report. This report stated the following: the spice trade is vital for the prosperity of the Netherlands, and in order for this trade to bring maximum benefit, the company must be a real exclusive supplier of spices in order to be able to control the volume of supplies and thus influence prices. Relatively speaking, through a monopoly, artificially create a shortage of spices, which in turn will allow them to keep high prices, and the company will receive high profits. And in order to ensure this monopoly, the company must destroy the remnants of the Spanish, Portuguese, and British possessions in the region, and finally take it under its control. And for this, it will need a powerful fleet that will ensure this control. This report pleased the leaders so much that Coen was actually promoted to executive director in the region, which should implement these plans. Coen started from the Banda Islands, where his former leader had previously been killed. These islands were very important, since at that time they were the only source of nutmeg supplies. And at that time, these islands also traded with the British East India Company. The Dutch tried to conquer these islands several times, but failed because the islanders received weapons and support from the British. Another problem was that the Banda Islands are a group of small islands, and the Dutch did not have enough forces to close each of them. Therefore, Coen had a rather tough plan: to conquer these islands and then destroy the nutmeg plantations on the smaller islands and concentrate its cultivation only on those that they could control. In addition, he also wanted to arrange a real genocide of the local population, so that then the Dutch planters would take their place. And when he managed to implement these plans, out of the 15,000 local population, less than 1,000 remained. And the VOKs became monopolists in the nutmeg trade. And this is just one example of Coen's approaches, but the Dutch acted in the same way on other islands. Of course, not everything worked out right away. For example, when Coen captured Jakarta in January 1619, a large fleet of the British East India Company soon arrived at the settlement. And after a short skirmish, the Dutch were forced to retreat. However, then, they were lucky in the sense that at that time, the structure of the British East India Company was ineffective. For them, just like for the Portuguese, each expedition was a separate project and was supposed to bring profit. Therefore, the British left Jakarta and sailed to India, where they loaded the ships with valuable cargo and returned home. And Coen a few months later triumphantly returned to Jakarta, which he later turned into an impregnable fortress. Over time, having regained strength, the company destroyed the scattered trading expeditions of the British, thereby completely ousting the British from that region. Moreover, the company acted quite harshly. What is the episode of the Ambon Massacre worth, when the Dutch executed 20 people who worked for the British? When the company was building its own fortifications, it later learned that there was an almost destroyed British factory on the island. And so that this factory would not attack them, they decided to execute all its participants. Of course, all this is an interpretation of events from the words of the Dutch themselves, but the situation itself clearly shows the ruthlessness of the Dutch methods towards their competitors. And it was with such methods that the company seized control over almost all the main islands, where modern Indonesia, the Philippines, and other island states are now located. Thanks to these conquests, the Dutch for a long time became monopolists in the trade of a number of popular spices, and the VOK company itself by the end of the 17th century had turned into one of the most powerful corporations.